Now, to one of the leading articles in the Sunday Times just last Sunday, written by Norma Costello. She wrote, a primary school lesson which portrays a deeply troubled and confused young Mary agreeing to become pregnant has been described as worrying by Ellen O'Malley Dunlop, Chief Executive Officer of the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. The lesson, entitled Mary Says Yes, features in a religious textbook that's being used in senior infant classes. An illustrated story depicts Mary agreeing to become pregnant by God after the angel Gabriel visits her bedroom. The text says Mary was deeply troubled, which indicates Mary did not know what was happening to her, said O'Malley Dunlop. The language could be linked in with feelings that children who are victims of sexual abuse have and do not know what is happening to them. It is worrying in light of all the reports published over the last 10 years, especially when coupled with images of Mary looking so young. Joining me now on the line is my next guest, and he is Michael Nugent. He's the chairperson of Atheist Ireland. Good morning, Michael, and welcome to the programme.
Good morning.
I gathered that you would agree with Ellen O'Malley Dunlop.
Yes, I think it shows how out of touch the Catholic Church are with just the reality of life in the real world. I mean, they're quite entitled, obviously, to believe whatever they want to believe in terms of the Annunciation and to believe that the Creator of the universe impregnated a virgin human being in order to give birth to himself. That's entirely their business, and we're not trying to stop them from doing that. But they shouldn't be portraying that information to 6-year-old infants in a way that suggests that if somebody comes to your bed in the middle of the night and you're confused and afraid, that you should trust them and say yes to them in terms of what they want to do.
But I would imagine that in the context of the classroom, this is expanded upon.
Well, what the text of the teacher's documentation says in terms of expanding on it is it tells the teachers to explain that her saying yes made everything possible, even though she didn't understand and even though she was afraid and confused. So that the expansion in terms of the teacher's manual makes it even worse.
But do you think that a 6-year-old is going to interpret it in that light?
We don't know what's happening in the lives of the 6-year-olds that are in the class. We don't know what might happen to them in the future. And if they're taught this type of information at a stage when they're quite vulnerable, and if they're taught it in the context of a school system that allows the Catholic Church to effectively indoctrinate children not only of their own religion but also of parents of other religions who are forced to send their children to those schools because it's the only school in the area, it's just not the way to...
But they're not forced to take religious... But hang on, they're not forced to take religious education that the parents don't want them to have.
Well, it's slightly more complicated than that. You have a constitutional right to opt your child out of religious education. But one of the things that Atheist Ireland constantly has complaints from parents is that when they try to exercise that right, in a lot of schools, the schools will say, well, we don't have the resources to look after your child while she or he is opted out. So what we'll have to do is we'll either leave them in the class, or else they'll say, well, you can come down and take them out of the class yourself for the half hour, which isn't really practical for most parents. So in some cases, you in practice can't exercise that right. And even if you can, they will incorporate the religious curriculum throughout the entire rest of the day as well. So it's impossible in practice to...
But surely the answer therefore is bigger. It's up to the government to provide non-denominational education, more and more Educate Together schools or such like.
It is. Well, more and more Educate Together schools isn't quite the solution, because even with the maximum number of Educate Together schools, you'll still have most schools in the country. There's over 3,500 or just under 3,500 primary schools in the country. Most of them will still be in areas where there's only one local school, and that will still be a Catholic school. So ultimately what you need to do is, Atheist Ireland has a policy called Schools Equality Pact. Now, PACT is an acronym, PACT, for Patronage, Access, Curriculum and Teaching. And you're right, the government needs to change all four of those areas simultaneously rather than just any one area.
Because it seems to be official Catholic policy, particularly when you look at what Archbishop Diarmaid Martin had to say in the relatively recent past. The Church, certainly in the Archdiocese of Dublin, wants to divest of these schools, the patronage thereof.
Well, it's not quite that. Again, it's more complicated than it seems on the surface. They're saying that they will divest some schools. Now, in practice, they don't have the resources to run the schools that they have because of just the shortage of manpower in the clergy anyway. But what they are saying is that they will divest some schools, but in return they want to have a stricter Catholic ethos in the ones that remain. And now that might sound fair, again, on the surface, and it would be fair if you were talking about Catholic schools as an add-on option onto a neutral education system that everybody has access to. But in practical terms, what that would mean is that some children would have access to more neutral schools, but most children would still be forced to go to a school that is not only Catholic but has an even stricter Catholic ethos.
So can we go back to this enunciation in this textbook, Growing Love? Now, it's published by Veritas Publication, and their spokesman, Aidan Chester, says it is apparent from the book, which is being taught to 6-year-olds, that Mary was a young woman when she became pregnant. In other words,
this uses the word young woman, but all of the pictures in the story, it's a children's book essentially, and all of the pictures portray Mary without adult characteristics. You know, she looks like a girl. She's sitting in her bed at night. She has a kitten with a heart on it beside her in the bed. It doesn't look like a woman in terms of the portrayal certainly for a 6-year-old child looking at the pictures. And the pictures, by the way, are also in the form of a poster that is supposed to be displayed beside a prayer table while the lesson is being given.
They also claim that feedback from parents to this programme has been overwhelmingly positive.
Well, they've only started the programme now, so I'm not sure exactly what they're basing that on. But certainly that particular lesson, the feedback that we've got and the feedback that the newspapers seem to be conveying is different. The course is in effect indoctrination, and the policy.
But wait now, it isn't indoctrination. Parents have the right to choose whether or not they want their children prepared for sacraments. Full stop.
Yeah, well,
and if you sign up to a Catholic school, it goes with the territory that you agree to them having religious instructions.
Yeah, and again, that would be fine if it was the case.
I mean, indoctrination suggests that that sat there and strapped to the chairs and are force-fed the stuff.
No, it doesn't. No, the Catholic Church itself says that their mission in education is to evangelise. And that's not me saying that. That's the
okay, and if you don't want your children evangelised, don't send them to a Catholic school.
But you don't have any choice. If in practical terms, if the only school in your area is a Catholic school, and if you're legally obliged to educate your child, and if homeschooling, which is the only other alternative, isn't practical, which it isn't for most people, then in real terms, you have no choice other than to send your child to a school where they're going to be indoctrinated. And again, in the General Directory for Catechesis, the Catholic Church says that it exists in order to evangelise in terms of its mission in schools, the carrying forth of the good news to every sector of the human race, so that by its strength it may enter into the hearts of men and women, the human race. That's why they are involved in education.
Yeah, okay, and what's wrong with that?
Well, what's wrong with it is that it's being funded by the state in over 90%
because these Catholic parents pay taxes.
Yes, they do pay taxes, and so does everybody else pay taxes. But the purpose of paying taxes is not to evangelise a particular religion. Everybody has the right to freedom of religion, including Catholics and including non-Catholics. And the only way for the state to ensure that everybody has their right to freedom of belief protected is for the state to remain neutral. So if as you are implying, if the Catholic Church was doing this using their own money, and if it was an added alternative on top of a fair education system that was neutral and that respected everybody's beliefs equally, then I would have no problem with it. The problem is when the state effectively cedes control of the state education system to the Catholic Church and doesn't provide an education system that respects everybody's beliefs.
It could also be argued that if it wasn't for the religious orders who started educating Catholics in this country, would we be so economically backward? I mean, if it wasn't for the likes of Edmund Rice, Nano Nagel, all the rest of them, Catherine Macaulay, who actually started to look after poor, uneducated Roman Catholics post-emancipation.
Yeah, you can go back into history, and again, everything is more complicated than it seems initially. The school system in Ireland in the 1800s was actually set up as a school system for all children, and the vast majority of primary schools were in fact given that the land was leased to the community, not to the Catholic Church. And there's a letter called the Stanley Letter upon which all of this was based, which was talking about teaching all children together with separate religious instruction for different denominations. But that eventually became hijacked by not only the Catholic Church but also the Church of Ireland, who wanted to have schools that were specifically evangelising for their own families and children. And so, in effect, what was set up as a state system where everybody would be educated together was hijacking religions for the purpose of indoctrination, and then the separate religious instruction, which is meant to be kept separate from the secular instruction, ended up being merged by a rule called Rule 68 of the national schools, which says that religion is the most important subject of all of the subjects, and that it has to be incorporated and integrated throughout the entire school day.
Whereas if you look at the American system, I mean, catechesis has to take place outside of the school, and that led to the emergence of Sunday schools, because the separation of church and state is
we've absolutely
so
no problem with that.
Yeah.
I mean, Sunday schools are fine. We have no problem with religions. People of religions practicing their religion and passing on their religious beliefs to their children. I mean, that's obviously a human right. But here's the way to look at it. If you look at it the other way around, if you imagine hypothetically that the state was funding even one school that actively taught children that there's no God. Now, we're not looking for that. We want neutral schools. But hypothetically, if there was even one school that actively taught children that there was no God, and that school was funded by the state and was the only school in a particular area, so that Catholic families, circumstance, had to send their child to a school that actively taught their children that there is no God, we would never hear the end of that until it was resolved, because people would immediately realise that it's wrong, and it's equally wrong the other way around.
Big discussion. Got to leave it there, Michael, and up on time. Thanks very much for taking the call.
Cheers.
Appreciate that. Bye-bye. That's Michael Nugent, chairperson of Atheist Ireland, and you heard him on Wednesdays, Data AM.